Movies like The Desert of the Tartars are the reason I made this channel. I think this movie has the greatest cinematography I've ever seen. It has an incredible cast of 1970s European all-stars. It has a score by Ennio Morricone, and most importantly, it's a deeply meaningful and poignant movie that's going to stay with me for a long time. So is this astounding movie super famous? Not really. It has about 2,500 votes on IMDb, and I hadn't heard of it before last week. Why the heck haven't more people seen such an incredible movie? I have some theories about that, but let's start out with the huge cast. Jacques Perrin stars here as Lieutenant Drogo. You might know him from Cinema Paradiso, where he plays the adult Toto. Here he's way younger, not quite as young as the young Toto, but still, it's a pretty different look. He was also in Z, which came out even before this great political thriller, and he's been in a bunch of other films, really. I think many of his performances are actually a bit one-dimensional. He kind of gives this look of childlike awe, and he can't exactly wipe it off his face sometimes. That's really all he gives in Cinema Paradiso in some ways, for instance. In this movie, he starts out as a young lieutenant in the army, and he has a bit of this awe, but by the time we get to the end of the movie, he's been transformed, and I think this is a good performance. Next, we have Giuliano Gemma playing Major Matisse. Gemma was a star of the spaghetti western. We're not talking Clint Eastwood and Lee Van Cleef here. We're talking legit Italian spaghetti westerns. Obviously, Dollar Trilogy, great movie, but we're going a little bit deeper into the crate for Gemma's movies. If you're into spaghetti westerns, you know who he is. Classics like Day of Anger or Blood for a Silver Dollar. Both of those movies have incredible soundtracks by Rizzo Ortolani and Gianni Ferrio. Again, we're not talking Ennio Morricone here. We're going just one step down the ladder into obscurity, I guess. You may have actually heard the scores for both of those movies ripped off in various Quentin Tarantino films. You may be realizing that this is a movie about the army, or that takes place in a military context. It isn't really a war movie. It's more of a movie about life in the army. It follows military officers on a distant outpost, not a historical film, more personal, philosophical thing. I'll get to what exactly this movie is in a second. It's not exactly obvious in some ways. For now, one thing to note is that there's approximately one woman in this movie who appears for approximately 1 minute. I don't think this will pass the Bechdel test. Max von Sydow is also in the movie. I think this might be my favorite role of his, and he's been in a lot of cool movies. Von Sydow usually plays an aristocrat with a secret, an aristocrat who's slightly demented. There are some moments of that here, but he is genuinely chivalric as well. Enigmatic, but chivalric and stately. He has a great mustache in this movie, and like I said, I think it's my favorite role of his, and I've seen him in a lot of random movies. Jean-Louis Trintignant is also in the movie. He tends to be, I guess, slightly sickly in some of his films, and this is no different. It's another great role. It's not an enormous role, but he does a good job. The last big name is Philippe Noiret. Not exactly sure how to pronounce his name, to be honest. He's only in the movie for a few scenes. It's a cameo, I guess. But he completes the Cinema Paradiso reunion, or pre-union, I guess I should say, since this came out many years before that movie. He plays Alfredo in Cinema Paradiso, the projectionist. Really, the whole cast of this movie is great. We see a lot of kind of a core of officers. At first, you might have a little trouble keeping track of who everyone is. They really make a point of making introductions, though, which is an interesting detail I'll touch on a little bit later. They make a point of making introductions. You'll probably catch on to who people are. It helps that a lot of the less well-known actors have particularly distinct appearances. Laurent Tirzif is one example. Don't really know how to say his name either. He's a bit like the French Willem Dafoe. He's got quite a look. Willem Dafoe is from Wisconsin, by the way, if you're wondering. Vittorio Gassman is also in this movie. I think he looks a bit like Martin Scorsese. This core of lieutenants just has a great look. Partly, I mean, already maybe you get a sense of, you got Max von Sydow and there, you got Jacques Perrin. These are people with a look. The actors in the movie, big part of the incredible palette and composition of the film. That's enough with that, though. It's a great cast. You get the idea. Maybe these aren't the most famous actors in the world, but it seems to me that just about every cool European film from the 1970s would have had at least one of these guys in it, and here we get them all. I mentioned already that the score is by Ennio Morricone. Maybe not everyone realizes just how prolific Morricone was. In addition to scoring a lot of really big movies and writing some of the best film music of all time, Morricone scored a ton of random, small movies, exploitation films, all kinds of stuff happening in Italy. This is kind of somewhere in between the score for a tiny movie nobody's ever heard of and a huge movie that is stuck in everybody's head. It doesn't really have the iconic hook of something like The Big, The Good, The Bad, and The Ugly. It's more atmospheric, I guess, but it isn't exactly experimental either. It doesn't have the experimentalism of some of its smaller scores, and there's no mouth harp to worry about here. I guess what I'm saying is that this is a fairly simple Morricone score, and large portions of the movie actually have no music at all, but I think it's a case of a little bit going a long, long way. And when the music comes in, the movie really picks up an emotional current. This film is based on a book by Dino Buzzati. I don't really know much about this book. Apparently, it's good, though. The movie was directed by Valerio Zerlini, who's not widely known today, and I don't know much about him either, to be honest. I will almost certainly be watching more of his movies, given how amazing this one is. So you can look forward to that one on the channel. We may have a real forgotten hero in Valerio Zerlini. The cinematographer was Luciano Tovoli. I mentioned this mainly because this movie looks so incredible. Right after he did this movie, he shot Suspiria, another movie with an iconic look. He also shot the Dario Argento movie Tenebrae. Haven't seen that. He shot Voyage in Time, the Tarkovsky documentary. Tovoli was still shooting movies as late as the mid-2010s. It's somewhat common for cinematographers to have long, long careers, but don't assume that everything he worked on turned to gold. A lot of his movies, the vast, vast majority, seem unremarkable, which is totally the opposite of this one. So maybe he doesn't get the sole credit for this movie looking amazing. I made a big claim at the beginning of this review that this is the best cinematography I've ever seen. I didn't just say that to get your attention. I wouldn't bet my life on it. I'm not sure if it's true, but it's certainly up there. The coolest looking movies I've covered on the channel so far are probably The Conformist and Chess of the Wind, two great movies. And I think this might look better than both of those. The style isn't quite as extreme as Chess of the Wind, although you would still probably describe this as being looking like a painting in many ways. The camera movement maybe isn't as extreme or incisive as it is in The Conformist. The composition's maybe not quite as striking in some ways, but again, it's a case of a little bit going a long way. When I started watching this movie, and particularly when the opening credits started, I thought, wait a minute, did this movie actually come out in 1976? I think the print that I have is some kind of Blu-ray restoration, so it is newer, but I wonder, honestly, if the opening credits themselves were somehow restored or added after, because they look really new. And the movie in general, it doesn't exactly look new, but it definitely doesn't look old. In a subtle way, it doesn't really look like anything I've ever seen. Part of this is because the movie is ridiculously crisp. On paper, I don't really know why this is. The film was shot in 35 millimeters with Eastman color, fairly typical stuff. But when you watch the average, sort of not that well-known European movie from the 1970s, like a lot of the ones I've covered on this channel, Foxtrot as an example, they don't look like this, you know. One reason might be that this movie was mainly filmed in the desert, where there's a lot of light, and that might really have helped them keep things sharp. The lighting in the movie is one of the main aspects of the cinematography and the composition. It's really an incredible aspect of the film. The movie's set in 1900, so we don't have electric lighting in the fortress where it takes place. Instead, we've got natural light basically throughout the movie that is beautifully massaged by the arches and passages of this castle. A big part of the look of the movie is the incredible location that it is filmed. And most of this movie was shot in Iran at the BAM Citadel, ARG-E-BOM, I really don't know how to say this, which is the largest Adobe building in the world, unless you count the Adobe headquarters, I suppose. This Adobe texture is also a huge part of the film, and it probably diffuses the light. The Adobe and the sand probably diffuses things in a way that maybe we're not used to, creates this like look of soft lighting in a way. The Citadel is a castle overlooking a huge ruined city, and it looks so cool. It looks so cool. One of my probably favorite film locations I've ever seen. And it's one of these places that in real life must look just so incredible, and they do it justice in the movie, I think. In 2003, a large part of the Citadel was destroyed in an earthquake. The copy of the film I have actually mentions this at the end. It looks like a lot of that damage has since been repaired, fortunately, although I guess it's not quite original. In a moment, I'll talk about why there are a bunch of French, I guess, soldiers hanging out in the desert. To some degree, the cinematography in this movie is just something you've got to see. This movie has instant visual interest, and you could have a great time watching it with the sound off, I think. I've talked a lot about huge positives here, so why isn't this movie super famous? I do think this movie is underrated and should definitely be known more widely than it is, but I can also understand how it isn't exactly legible to everyone. This movie is deeply meaningful, but the telling dynamics of the film take a while to emerge. Maybe that's just a fancy way of saying it's boring. Not exactly, though, I think. When we get sort of to the last third of the movie, and once you realize, oh, this is what's going on, it's a striking movie. Before that, it's not exactly boring, but I think the movie kind of leans into a couple of different ideas, and it might be a little hard to understand exactly what it is. It's kind of a historical film in some ways. It's kind of a military film in some ways, I guess. It also is like almost maybe sort of satirical in some ways, depending on your viewpoint. It kind of has the logic of a horror movie, though, at some points. But it also seems like really an intellectual film, although exactly what its purpose is and point is isn't immediately obvious. So if you watch this movie, maybe try to have some patience. For the most part, this is a movie about nothing. Very actively about nothing. It's a movie about nothing happening, I guess, to be more specific. It's a movie about nothing happening, which is an interesting thing to make a movie about. Or maybe it's not an interesting thing. It's an ironic thing to make a movie about in some ways. Once we get to the final third, like I said, we shift gears in some ways, and it becomes quite striking. But before that, you might be a little bit confused. Let me talk about the plot briefly to fill some things in here. Lieutenant Drogo starts out in a city of some sort. He calls it the city. It's not clear exactly what city this is, but he kicks off his career in the military with his first assignment, being the fortress of Bastiano, which is a big fort overlooking this village or overlooking this ruined city, but also guarding the border. He sets off on his horse from the city. He rides for 2 days, crosses some mountains, and arrives at this incredible fortress on the threshold of mountain and desert. It's not really obvious what's going on here geographically. Tartars seems to refer to an ethnic group living on the steppe, mainly in Russia and Mongolia, and the book the film was based on was actually called The Tartar Steppe. Now, that's not very close to Iran or to France. Even in 1900, I don't think the French Empire would have really come close to the steppe. No French cities would have been a 2-day ride away. It's a French movie. The people, they speak French. So some of them have French names and look pretty French, but not everybody does. Some of the names could be from other places in Europe. It's a little unclear who is who and where they are. I've actually seen some people say that the title refers to Tartarus from Greek mythology, which is some sort of underworld. I'm a bit skeptical about this, but I think it's clear that the locations here are supposed to be somewhat abstract. And this is a movie that is mainly living in a metaphorical realm. Historical drama, not so much. This is a metaphorical, an existential film more than anything. So Drogo, he rides for 2 days and he shows up at this fortress. He meets the other officers, introduces himself, and things are a little bit off, I think. From the beginning, you can tell that something isn't quite right. This is where I say that the movie acts a little bit like a horror movie, with Drogo showing up in this new place and finding that it has some odd rhythms. We see that some of the people there are a bit sickly. Nobody really wants to be there, it seems, but nobody really wants to leave. There's some eerie moments, and it almost seems like we're building to something spooky, but nothing really happens. And in fact, it turns out that the defining characteristic of Bastiano is that nothing happens there. The goal is to look out over this border. It's to make sure no riders come across the plains, that the Tartars don't come to invade. But for decades and decades and decades, nothing has happened. People have just waited around. And that's really, like I said, the defining characteristic of this movie, a movie about nothing happening. Now, I'll get into the last third of the movie in a second. But before I mention some spoilers, I just want to say that nothing happening at a fortress, protecting a border against attackers who don't really seem to arrive, might be very fitting for 1976, which was in the middle of the Cold War. In some places, the Cold War was fairly hot, but in other places, I guess it was mainly a standoff. It's an interesting historical angle on it, I guess. To really make any headway into this movie and what makes it poignant and interesting, I think I have to talk about the end of it. This will involve some spoilers. You should go watch the movie first, I guess, up to you. I think the defining dynamics of the film become fairly obvious once we get towards the end of the movie. Maybe some astute viewers would pick up on it much earlier than I did. Maybe this video will help point you in the right direction and attune you to what I think some of the significant ideas are. It becomes clear somewhat early on that Bastiano is a dying place. Von Sydow calls it a dead border, or his character does, a dead border. It's a dying place where military decorum is at the forefront, but kind of arbitrary. I mentioned there's a lot of introductions. They go through around the table introducing everybody who's got their fancy uniforms on. They have a lot of procedure. They've got a lot of rules, and yet nothing happens. This is one of the elements of the film that's like almost vaguely satirical. But I don't think this is exactly the idea, to lampoon institutional, strictness exactly. I think there's something much deeper going on here. One of the things we'll see is that in this dying place, logic doesn't quite seem to work normally. What does that mean? Well, I'll get into it in a second. The movie really changes gear, I think, when the fortress starts being explicitly depopulated. When Drogo first shows up, people say, this is a great place to start your career. It's a great place for a young lieutenant to build and rise through the ranks. And in fact, he does work his way up through the ranks. He does get promoted. When Drogo first shows up, he has dinner with the officers in this fancy mess hall. They have fancy meals served by waiters with special uniform. The whole thing seems substantive. And it seems, like I said, that the advice might be true. He does get promoted. He does start to build a career. Sure, nothing is happening, but there's a little society here. There's a little institution built around this nothingness, right? Then more and more officers are reassigned or die. And slowly it seems like maybe things are winding down a little bit. Like I said, the movie shifts gear when you learn that it is explicitly, there's a very deliberate pullback coming from the army, that they want to step back from Bastiano. This grand table in the mess hall starts having fewer seats with people in them. And here we start to realize that this institution might not be everything it's cracked up to be. In a way, it is still esteemed, but it's dying. And it's funny how often those things go together, esteemed but dying. In a lot of movies, institutions are fairly firm. But in the real world, most people work for companies that they don't really believe in or respect, or live in countries that they don't really resonate with entirely. They depend on countless institutions that don't really make sense. It's a bit depressing, really. But if you think about people's relationships with the institutions, they're almost never fulfilling relationships of respect and mutual understanding. And yet in a lot of movies, the institutions are either sort of neutral structures or vaguely positive entities that are maybe come in conflict with each other. I realize that's super vague. I think this movie is really about that other case, the slightly more depressing case of a dying institution, being involved in a dying institution, trying to build your career in a dying institution, trying to move up through the world as the world is dying. All these things. I think that's deeply relatable to a lot of people, to be honest. Where things really get interesting is when we see the kind of logic that arises in a dying place. I think this is the crux of the movie, the kind of logic in a dying place. It's a backwards logic in some ways. Let me give you one great example. This is going to be a huge spoiler, so, cover your ears if you haven't seen the movie yet. But right before some of the most senior officers are about to leave Bastiano, and they're really winding down, and Max von Sydow is about to leave, for instance, one of the lieutenants is looking through his binoculars, and he sees the enemy. At least he thinks he does. It's a little hard to know, but he thinks he can see them building a road in from the horizon. And Drogo learns about this. But they decide not to tell anybody because they don't want to prevent the impending departures. If something finally happens at Bastiano, they say, better for there to be fewer people there. Better for them to capture the glory alone, I guess. Of course, this really doesn't make any sense. If the enemy is on the horizon and you're guarding this place, you should probably tell people about it. You should probably stop the retreat. You should probably bring more people. But in this dying place, in this dwindling institution, there emerges this different type of logic. I guess on one level you might just say that they're acting in self-interest, but it's really more complicated than that. It is true that there's, coming to the forefront is this relationship between the institutional interest and the personal interest and how those are kind of reconciled. And then when it's not just a personal interest, but in fact an interest of a small subset, small little team or something like that, running sort of counter to the bigger institution, or maybe you learn that in fact this bigger institution actually works in other ways than you realized. You know, you think, oh, well, this is a dying place, I should optimize for yourself, and you're kind of keeping it a secret. And then you go and tell your boss, and you realize that they feel the same way. And maybe their boss feels the same way, and maybe actually up the chain, it's an open secret. Everybody knows this kind of thing, or something like that. Like I said, logic works in a different way. These things are kind of convoluted, but I think they're going to be deeply familiar to anyone who has ever been part of a dwindling institution, which, let's face it, is everyone. It's possible the human race is a dwindling institution in face of climate change or other catastrophic threats. And you can actually see, I think there's an interesting parallel between some people who talk about, for instance, not having children because they're afraid of bringing kids into a desperate world or something like that. In some ways, that is a logic of a dwindling institution. I don't know. Interesting comparison. When the end finally comes in this movie, when the enemy is finally on the doorstep, Drogo and the fortress are so atrophied that they can hardly even witness the moment. Somehow by the end of the movie, logic has almost completely reversed itself. Drogo escapes the fortress at the last possible moment. Had he stayed for 30 seconds more, he probably would have been killed. But he feels like a failure for leaving. He regrets it. He feels bad about it, even though to stay would have meant certain death. Anyway, there are a ton of examples here of all the strange dynamics that occur, all the strange alliances that are formed, and the relationships that melt away. The allure of gossip in the final days. There's an attendant character, for instance, who becomes significant right at the end, even though he's sort of spouting conspiracies that otherwise you might not listen to at all. He's gossiping. You might not care about gossip at all when you're in an earlier phase and you're more committed to the decorum of the institution. But now suddenly, Drogo is listening to him. It was kind of amazing to me that I can't think of another movie really that tells a similar story at a similar level. I think there are other movies about living through sort of backwards times or the grifts that people do. But I don't think any of them are quite as subtle as this one. I think Underground, the Kusturica film, for instance, is another example of something that's kind of similar in some ways. But I don't think I've seen anything quite as subtle or existential as this movie. And this plotline is something that is going to stay with me for a long time. It's something that I found to be fairly moving. I will say, though, that if there's one thing I would complain about with this movie, it's that the film itself is slightly impersonal. And it was not a movie that I felt like enormously moved by as I was watching it, partly because I didn't really start to have a reference point for what the movie was about until the last third. But also it is, like I said, it's just a little bit impersonal. It does have some emotional moments, but it didn't hit me in the face in the way that some other movies had. That said, I do think it will stay with me for a long time. Anyway, like I said, The Desert of the Tartars is a phenomenal movie. It's astounding in many different dimensions. It requires a bit of patience, I guess, but if you have that, you really can't go wrong here. And it makes me happy to share this movie with you. I think it's really the essence of this channel.